Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Larissa Vigu-Picard, Executive Director of Pejepscot History Center, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the 2022 Chamberlain Legacy Lecture. This Legacy Lecture series is the reinvented Chamberlain Days that we formerly held. It's a way of continuing to honor the extraordinary man and his family whose house we maintain and operate as a museum, but it's also a way to share his legacy in new ways. The goal is really to use Chamberlain and the many aspects of his life as a jumping off point to end up landing at the 20th century counterparts of those various aspects. A true Renaissance person, almost any subject you can think of can be connected back to him. Not just the most obvious, war and the military, higher education, government, but also women's rights, religion, race, science, natural resources, animals, gardening, architecture, the sea, literature, parenting, business. I could go on probably for a couple more hours, but I will not. Over time, we hope to address many of these. In other words, to connect his 19th century world to the lives of people today. I think you'll agree that tonight's topic is one that is important to many, many people today: disability, external and internal wounds, and how we human beings persevere in the face of suffering. We are so lucky to have been introduced to our speaker tonight, for she has thought and researched deeply about this subject. On a personal note, this is the single most fascinating and moving thing for me about Joshua Chamberlain. How did he manage the repercussions of his near mortal wound? How did he go on to accomplish so much despite great physical and presumably mental trauma? How did it affect his decision-making and his sense of self and his relationships? The most important one being with his wife, Fanny, who similarly dealt with her own disability and pain from a long, slow decline to total blindness. I will let our speaker address these questions in the greater context of how the Civil War changed the it wounded and changed even our societal notions of masculinity and suffering. I will now turn it over to, as I mentioned, Kid, to introduce her. And Kid is the Director of Research at Massachusetts Historical Society. And so we're very fortunate to have both of them here tonight. Kid.
Nice. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Larissa. I'd also like to echo thanks for Amy, who's not here, and for Tori, and also the members of the board, and also for the wonderful volunteers who brought all the chairs in here for you this evening. It is an honor and a joy to be back here in Joshua Chamberlain's Brunswick with all of you and with our special guest tonight. I first came to Brunswick as a student at Bowdoin College, and when I was there, I set out to write for the Bowdoin Orient, the student paper about Joshua Chamberlain. And in trying to figure out what to write, I read histories that were written about Chamberlain by other historians, by other scholars, instead of going up to the third floor of Hawthorne Longfellow Library, that beautiful special collections room, and looking and touching and seeing his handwriting on the paper. And I did not feel like I could do that for the same reason that every time I was in that very special place, I was always aware, and I'm sure most of you have seen the Special Collections Library at Bowdoin, I was always aware when I was in there of the Medal of Honor and of the bracelet that he had made for Fanny. Mm-hmm. So for me, being in that space didn't really feel like being in a research room as much as a shrine. For me, as a Chamberlain, a hero worshiper of Chamberlain, he was more than just a man. He was a hero. He was someone who had ascended to the pantheon of American gods. He was a white knight, someone whose actions could not really be assailed. And so in viewing him in that way, I felt as if I, a mere undergraduate and a novice historian, was unworthy of him, unworthy of reading his letters, unworthy of touching pieces of paper he had touched. Now that, of course, is not the correct way to view the past or to view historical figures. To do so suggests that they are unknowable and that the past ultimately is unknowable. To do so robs these revered figures of what is most important, their humanity. It robs us, at the same time, of not just an understanding of them, but also of our own potential. They were not demigods whose deeds could never be understood or replicated. This denies, again, them what they suffered and the real issues that they faced that we still face. Thus, scholarship that demystifies historical figures, history that shows that the humanity behind the deeds of revered individuals, that is history and writing that is truly, truly important. It reminds us that these great figures suffered and bled, as all humans do. Our speaker tonight produces such histories that remind us of the frailty of everyone and reminds us that we can certainly live up to them in our own time. She has also, in my opinion, written the best work on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in decades. This wonderful book, which you should pick up in the back of the room. Sarah Handley-Cousins is clinical assistant professor in the Department of History and the associate director of the Center for Disability Studies at the University at Buffalo, where she teaches numerous wonderful classes that her students are very lucky to have, including the Civil War and Reconstruction, U.S. disability history, war and American memory, and bodies at war. Professor Handley-Cousins is the author of the brilliant book, Bodies in Blue, Disability in the Civil War, which won the Outstanding Book Award from the Disability History Association in 2020. She is also the author of several essays, including Speaking for Themselves, Disability in Civil War Medical Photography, which was published in The War Went On, New Perspectives on Civil War Veteranhood, and Wrestling at the Gates of Death, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and the Non-Visible Disability in the Post-Civil War North, published in the Journal of the Civil War Era. She has also contributed to the Washington Post's Made by History and also written for the New York Times. She is the founder and producer of the award-winning Dig, a history podcast, one of the best out there. And she is also the executive editor of Nursing Cleo, which is an open-access, peer-reviewed, collaborative blog project that ties historical scholarship to present-day issues related to gender and medicine. We are so lucky and honored to have her, Professor Handley-Cousins.
That was certainly the fanciest introduction I've ever gotten. and add that to, oh, no big deal. Just Frederick Douglass talked at this exact same podium. No pressure whatsoever. Can you jump to the next slide? So thank you so much, everyone, I'm going to try not to walk around too much, for having me here. Thank you to Larissa for organizing this. I cannot tell you, as a little girl Civil War nerd, of which there aren't a ton, and a Chamberlain fangirl. This is just such an incredible honor. And the fact that, you know, little kid me would never have believed that people would actually come and listen to me talk about this stuff. So it's just an incredible honor. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is we'll center Chamberlain, right? But I also kind of want to talk a little bit more broadly about disability in the Civil War era and how we continue to think about Civil War disability today, and also just how we tend to think about disability in general today, and what we can sort of take away from Chamberlain's example in that regard. So in 2015, PBS premiered its American history response to these blockbuster British hits like Downton Abbey and Victoria, and it was called Mercy Street. The show, which one historian dubbed Grey's Anatomy in crinolines, was essentially an 1860s hospital drama, complete with medical mysteries and lots of romantic subplots. And I was very excited at the time that it came out because it had Ted from How I Met Your Mother with this incredible Civil War beard, and I was very into it. So the showrunners actually worked very closely with historians and museum curators to make sure that the show was not only accurate, but grounded in very current scholarship. For instance, there's an episode that has a story about a smallpox epidemic in a contraband camp, which is drawn right out of the historian Jim Downes's work on smallpox among freed people, his book, Sick from Freedom. And while I very much enjoyed the show, and how could I not, right? There was something else about it that really stuck with me. So the plot of the show, yeah, you can go to the next one. The plot of the show, like many hospital dramas, was centered on the doctors and nurses of the Mansion House Hospital in Union-occupied Alexandria, Virginia. And in each episode, there were interesting new medical cases that came into the hospital, and the doctors would fix them up and send them along on their way. Essentially, each of these bloody soldiers serves as a problem for the doctors to solve. At times, wounded soldiers serve as symbols. For example, in the very first episode, a young man comes into the hospital literally glued to the American flag with his own blood, right? It doesn't get much more symbolic than that. One historian, Megan Kate Nelson, quipped on Twitter that his cause of death was extreme symbolism. And I ripped this is an aside, right? This is like not really in the talk, but I ripped into this on Twitter. I was like, this is the silliest thing I've ever seen. And someone that I knew who works for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine was like, oh no, that came out of our archives. Like, that's a real case. So this really happened. This poor young man. Anyway, so what struck me as so telling about this show wasn't just its overwrought dramatic plot lines, which I'm very into, but was that despite all of its attention to modern Civil War scholarship, it was telling a story where wounded and disabled soldiers were either the objects of medical fascination or were the symbols of the suffering of the war. There's something about the bodily toll of the Civil War that fascinates us. In the book, The March by E.L. Doctorow, for instance, a doctor named Reed Sartorius tells one of his patients, this young man named Corporal Albion Sims, and some of you may know this if you've read the novel, but Albion Sims has been devastatingly wounded when an accidental powder explosion drives a railroad pike through his head. And he's still alive, he is still conscious, but his consciousness resets every few seconds. So he never is able to, he doesn't understand where he is, he doesn't understand what's happening to him. Reed Sartorius is this German physician who sees Albion Sims and tells him that his survival is a miracle. And it's that miracle that invites our fascination, right? He's not telling him your survival is a miracle because you get to live, because he's not going to live, right? He can't continue to live. His survival is a miracle because Dr. Reed Sartorius gets to learn from him. And that was true in Mercy Street, right? That miracle inviting our fascination, that the blood and gore of the war inviting our fascination. But I think that it's true of Civil War disability in general. The gore of this war is continually inviting our fascination. No film or television show is quite complete without that graphic amputation scene. So the very famous hospital scene from Gone with the Wind, right here in the center, that's an amputation over there happening on Mercy Street. And my personal favorite, Phoebe from Friends, living out her past lives, in one of which she was a Civil War nurse performing amputations. No battlefield tour is quite finished without a description of the blood slick on the floor of the hospital. When I was living in Gettysburg and spending a lot of time on that battlefield, I remember distinctly going to a house that was used as a field hospital and being shown sort of the holes that had been driven into the wooden floor where they had used to drain the blood into the basement, right? Or looking out the window and saying, like, the pile of limbs came all the way up to the frame of the window. I'm very popular when I go to parties and talk about this stuff. And this actually, this is a photograph of Civil War medical reenactors. People who, you know, reenact this stuff. And also when I was at Gettysburg, at Parents' Weekend, of all things, there was a Civil War, I gotta say Gettysburg, this is appropriate, right? There was a Civil War medical reenactor tent set up, and there was all sorts of other things going on too, but this is where everybody ended up, right? And they were reenacting an amputation of a leg that was ground beef around a dowel and cutting. I mean, it was gross, but people were really into it. Can you go to the next one? And there have been several recent exhibitions of that Civil War medical photography as well. The Life and Limb exhibition is a traveling exhibition now that goes around and displays these images. So there's just something about the way that the Civil War destroys men's bodies that continues to fascinate us. But even though we have this fascination with the bodily destruction of the Civil War, we still know relatively little about actual wartime disability. That is, while it's very common to catch glimpses of injury and illness in our history and in our media, those glimpses are usually only there either to discuss the medical history of the war by focusing on the doctors, or to illustrate how destructive this war was. Historians of the Civil War have very rarely looked at disability as disability. In other words, they've rarely tried to understand disabled soldiers and veterans as actors themselves. And this actually fits very squarely into a very traditional, and I would say quite outdated, way of interpreting disability as an individual medical problem that comes under the purview of doctors that should be cured whenever possible. And within the field of disability studies, and not to go too like theory on you, but this is called the medical model of disability. It's a very traditional way of understanding what disability is. And many disability scholars and historians, like myself, opt for what we call the social model, which is a way of understanding disability as socially and culturally constructed, meaning that it's an identity and a category that shifts and changes over time and place and environment. But moreover, the sort of particular goal of disability history is to place real disabled people at the center of the story, right? Not the doctors, not cultural depictions. And so that was my goal in my book, Bodies in Blue. I can't even say the name of my own book correctly. I wanted to write something that examined the experiences and lives of real disabled soldiers and veterans. I didn't want to use the bodies of wounded and disabled men as I saw them being used in things like Mercy Street as little more than props. I wanted disability really to be the center of my focus. And one of the problems was there was very little written on it. And so there was a lot of time of me just kind of like feeling my way around and trying to figure out how I was actually going to accomplish this, right? And so as I was starting to get my feet wet in the field and sort of feebly feel my way towards a dissertation, I was tremendously inspired by this new wave of scholarship that was coming out right around that time by scholars that you may have encountered before, like Brian Craig Miller, Megan Kate Nelson, Brian Jordan, that had started to explore the issue of Civil War disability a little bit. And so as I was working through all of their work, I started to notice something about them. And I started to notice that they were all talking about amputations. And soon I realized, oh, wait a second, everything that's been written about Civil War disability is actually just about amputation. There is an exception to this, and I will come back around to this at the very end. The exception to that is psychiatric disability, which is still very understudied, but is starting to get some very much needed attention from scholars like Diane Miller Somerville, Dylan Carroll, and Catherine Thompson, looking at what we generally call war trauma, but we might recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I was poring over all of this great literature, I found that not only were they all talking about amputation, but they actually were using the same source material, the exact same source material. One manuscript collection from a handwriting contest that was sponsored in 1865, 1866, and then again in 1867, to judge samples of handwriting from right arm amputees who were learning to write again using just their left arm. And, you know, I want to make clear, it makes sense that they were all using this manuscript collection, right? I mean, it's incredible. The letter writers, the handwriting sample writers, I should say, were encouraged to talk about their lives and to talk about their experiences after losing their arms. And so there's just a ton in there, right? There's a ton about how they think about the war. There's a ton about how they think about their amputations. So that it is really a cool collection. And this is, I should say, in the, I believe it's in the Library of Congress. It's called the William Oland Bourne collection. More importantly, though, other than just the fact that this is a great collection, there's another really good reason that there's so much literature on amputation specifically. It was the most dramatic and obvious wound of the era. And the absence of an arm or a leg quickly became symbolic of the losses of the war itself. Amputation was a critical part of 19th century Americans' cultural attempts to try to understand what the war did to bodies. During the war, amputation became the most powerful symbol of the war's destructive power. Songs, poems, stories, popular imagery abounded that dealt with amputation and its role in the war. You can skip ahead. So take this poem, for instance. And I should say, before I read it, the image is from the same publication, but it's not from it didn't accompany this poem. But the image is there as sort of an example of just how much of this imagery existed that dealt with the wounds of the war. And you can sort of understand, if you're trying to capture that in an image, you have to make the disability visible, right? So something that has visible impact like an amputation is common. So this poem is called The Veteran. This is just one stanza from it. It was published in Harper's Weekly in 1867. And in it, a Union veteran, inexplicably still wearing his worn-out uniform 2 years after the war has ended, leans on a crutch on a village green, and he's using tales from his army life in an attempt to sell quack patent medicines. to make a living. So after selling some of his bottles, the veteran pauses, and the narrator of the poem watches him very closely and says this: "And while he paused in his simple strain, 'twas little he recked of trade or gain, for lost in his tale his soul had wrought a grander vision, a nobler thought. He thought of his country's triumph, the price of his own most costly sacrifice, and a loving glance diffused and dim fell down upon his shattered limb. I saw a tear on his eyelid flash, I saw it fall from the quivering lash, and he spake these words unheard of men: all that I gave, I would give again." Right? This is really exemplifies not only 19th century schlock sort of poetry, right? But also the really sentimentalized way that people are thinking about these kinds of disabilities, right? We can see in that poem that, first of all, Civil War disability meant amputation, right? They were synonymous. We can see that the disabled veteran sort of believed that that sacrifice was worth it, right? 1867, he's still standing out there looking down at his empty sleeve and crying and saying, "I would do it again," right? Sort of giving us this idea that, at least in the public mind, all veterans believed that their sacrifices were connected to what the war was about. They had a belief that they had made sacrifices, of course, but that those sacrifices were part of a larger effort to save the Union. At the same time, this is also a poem about a veteran who has ultimately failed in life, right? He's standing around on a village green, shilling patent medicines, and still going on about the war 2 years later, wearing his uniform, right? This is not a guy who is super well adjusted. So this kind of literature and imagery sets up a series of black and white categories of how veterans are depicted after the war. All wounded veterans were proud of their bodily sacrifices, yet all veterans are also sort of dependent beggars, right? This is kind of the dichotomy that we see. So as I was starting to get into my research, I found myself really drawn to this question, what about everybody else, right? What about the disabled soldiers who were really successful, who weren't standing out there trying to make a living by selling patent medicines? What about the ones who thought that their wounds were not worth the sacrifice, right? Maybe regretted that this had happened to them, or who had mixed feelings about what they had given up. And of course, the simplest questions there is, what about everybody who wasn't an amputee, right? What was their experience? And so as I started to investigate, the more I investigated, the more that I found that there was just a huge amount out there about disability and this war that we as scholars really just did not yet understand. So for instance, looking at the statistics about amputation in the Union Army from the massive medical compendium that's published after the war called the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion. It's this huge book series that the Surgeon General's office puts out after the war, documenting sort of the work of the Surgeon General's office during the war. They take incredibly detailed statistics about wounds and about diseases and all sorts of things like that. So in that, I found that while 281,881, very precise, Union soldiers were wounded and survived the war, of that number, so of the total number documented that were wounded and survived, of that number, only 20,802, or roughly 7%, were amputees. So why was it that this disability that actually only affected 7% of wounded veterans, why was it that that held such a powerful place in our consciousness, while all of this other stuff was essentially ignored? And it's not that amputation didn't generate social anxieties or pose serious challenges for amputees, right? There's been a wave of scholarship recently, those books that I mentioned before, that has demonstrated that it absolutely did, right? But as the impairment that was most closely associated with the war I argue that amputation just did not raise the same kind of questions about legitimacy and worthiness that were raised by less straightforward ailments. So, Civil War Americans are seeing amputees in the pages of the issues of their issues of Harper's Weekly, right? They're reading these kinds of poems. They're listening to these maudlin songs that come from the end of the war called like The Empty Sleeve, right? It's something that's kind of pervading the culture. And in part because of its high visibility, amputation just made sense to Civil War era Americans. It made sense that it was disabling. It made sense that it affected men's ability to work and to fight. It made sense that the government should compensate men for that loss, right? And I'll give you a quick example of sort of the difference between how we think about, or how Civil War Americans, I should say, think about amputation versus other kinds of ailments. So in chapter 2 of my book, I wrote about the ways that disabled and ailing soldiers tried to use their bodies as exculpatory evidence during court-martials. So for example, a soldier who may have been court-martialed for leaving his post arguing, well, I left my post because I have diarrhea, right? Of which there was a lot, right? That was happening quite a bit. Never expected to write quite so much about diarrhea, but I did. And in that, I found the story of a soldier named John O'Neill, who was court-martialed for punching his commanding officer, a man named Captain Graff. Now, the story that O'Neill tells is that he was in the midst of passing a kidney stone. And he was in an incredible amount of pain, and his captain just wouldn't leave him alone, was trying to get him to be quiet, was trying to get him to go back to his tent, and he just lost his patience, and he hit the guy in the face, right? And Captain Graff, on the other hand, says, listen, this guy's faking it, right? He's just a drunk. And poor O'Neill, his doctor even testified that he did actually pass a kidney stone. The kidney stone was there, right? So they produced the kidney stone, but even then, the court-martial board didn't believe him and convicted him anyway. So even though he was going through this, they said, too bad, you're not behaving like a soldier should, and he's convicted. Now compare that to the experience of another soldier, this one named Private Michael Young, who was court-martialed for drunkenness and disorderly behavior. Now in this case, Private Michael Young was absolutely drunk. He was drunk. And he was walking around camp whacking other soldiers with his cane and yelling at them and flailing abuses at them. Everyone on the court-martial board agreed. The guy was drunk and he was misbehaving, right? There's no question about that. However, he was exonerated. And in the court-martial paperwork, they all say, yeah, we agree, he was doing this, but he was an amputee. And he was a member of the Invalid Corps. And they all agreed in the paperwork that he deserved some deference based on his physical sacrifice. And so amputation just meant something to Civil War era Americans that a kidney stone just didn't, right? So my problem then became, as I am approaching this project, well, if all of the good sources, like the handwriting, right, samples, are about amputation, how on earth am I going to find all the other guys, right? Where am I going to find those sources? And so literally on a whim, I suggested to my advisor that maybe I could write about this general that I had been sort of a fangirl of when I was in college at Gettysburg. Can you skip ahead? You know who I'm talking about, right? And here is the part of my talk where I'm going to tell you a bunch of things about Chamberlain that you probably already know. So just pretend that this is new for you. So Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, as we all know, was a college professor, commissioned colonel of the 20th Maine. He and his regiment played, of course, a pivotal role in the Union victory at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, although depending on where I give this talk, sometimes people, throw that back at me, right? No, that's not true. And I very vaguely recalled from my time studying the Civil War in college that Chamberlain had been wounded at the Battle of Petersburg. And that's really all I knew. I knew that he'd been wounded, and I knew that he wasn't an amputee. So I thought, okay, maybe there is something there, right? Maybe there's something in his papers or something that I could find. And it turned out that I was right. But I also found much more than I expected. Chamberlain ended up becoming the perfect entry for me to start to explore, and I hope shift the way that we think about disability during the Civil War era. And I should say, I pitched that to my advisor, and then just a few weeks later, on literally a wing and a prayer, I said, well, I guess the place to start is Brunswick, Maine. And I drove up here, and I came to the Pejepscot, and they handed me Alice Rain's Truelocks collection, and it was just lost my mind. It was just incredible. So a really important place in my life story. So, let me take a step back here and tell you a bunch of stuff that you already know about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I mentioned, of course, that he's in command of the 20th Maine, but as we all know, by 1864, he was promoted to brigadier general, leading a brigade in the Union 5th Corps. During the siege of Petersburg, there was this push by Ulysses S. Grant, in charge of the entire Union Army, but embedded with the Army of the Potomac in the vital Eastern Theater in Virginia, to capture the city of Petersburg, which was this incredibly important railroad hub, controlling the railroads that fed into the Confederate capital of Richmond. In June 1864, Grant is at the end of the Overland campaign, this long series of battles starting at the Wilderness and winding all the way down to Petersburg. And he's hoping that this can be the punch through these very heavy Confederate fortifications around the city. So on June 18th, 1864, Chamberlain is a part of that attack at a point in the Confederate fortification line, or the Dimmock Line, called Reeves Salient. And as he's leading his men, he discovers a patch of ground that is very muddy. It's going to be very difficult to get his men to go through it. And so he tries to get them to perform a left oblique. In other words, to kind of shift themselves towards the left and continue on their attack. So he raises his saber in one hand and the flag of the 5th Corps up in the other, so that his men can see his signal, and he's signaling, and just at that moment, he's shot in the right hip. I did not make this, I can't take credit for it. This was put together by two urologists, William Harmon and Charles McAllister. I owe them a great deal for making this image. So that bullet, the mini ball, traveled through his right hip to the left, crushing his bones and cutting into his bladder and urethra. He tried to hold himself up. He tries to brace himself up with the flag and the saber. But eventually he loses so much blood that he collapses. And actually his very first thought is, my God, I've been shot in the back, right? What is my mother gonna say when she finds out I've been shot in the back? He later describes those agonizing minutes laying on the battlefield like this. I lay now straight out on my back, too weak to move a limb, the blood forming a pool under and around me, more blood than the books allow a man. I had not much pain. It was more like a stunning blow, a kind of dull tension. My teeth shut sharp together hard like lockjaw. So I lay looking, thinking, sinking, the tornado tearing over and around. Dull, hoarse, faint cries in the air, hisses, spatters, thuds, thunderbolts mingling earth and sky, and I moistening that little space of Mother Earth for a cabbage garden for some poor fellow, black or white, unknowing, unthinking. Very Chamberlain, right? Why use one word when you can use 14? So Chamberlain was removed to the division hospital where surgeons explored the wound. At one point, according to there are various different descriptions of what happens. At one point, from what I understand, they actually used a ramrod to go through, to pass through, to try to get the mini ball out, and they were not able to do that. Eventually, they were able to locate and cut out the ball. That's how close it was to the skin on his other hip. But other than that, there really was not much that they could do for him there in that field hospital. So eventually, and understandably so, Chamberlain asked the surgeons to set him to the side and put their efforts towards the other wounded men that were filling that hospital. The surgeons agreed, so he asked for a pen and paper, and he wrote one last letter to his wife, which is in the special collections. And if you haven't been up there, you really should go see it. It's incredible. But as we all know, Chamberlain did not die. When the surgeons realized that he was defying their expectations, when they realized that he wasn't dying, they attempted to correct some of the damage to his urethra. They managed to keep Chamberlain alive long enough for him to be transferred to the Annapolis Naval Hospital, where he underwent more surgery. For 2 months, he later recalled, he was, quote, wrestling at the gates of death, in agonies inexpressible, convulsions, death chills, lashings, despairing surgeons, waiting embalmers through this valley of the shadow of death in 5 months back in the front with my men. He served out, as we all know, the remaining years of the war, was promoted twice for bravery, was present at the passing of the armies after the surrender at Appomattox, and left the Army in 1865 as a brevet major general. When Chamberlain returned to his civilian life, he seemed the embodiment of everything an ideal Union veteran should be, right? Charming, dare I say, handsome, war hero who had made sacrifices but who never wavered in his dedication to cause and country. During his 3 years in the Army, Chamberlain, of course, played a critical role in numerous battles, was wounded 6 times, and was seriously ill at least twice. He returned quickly to the field each time and rose through the ranks. After the war, he, of course, wins 4 years as the governor of Maine, and then spends 12 years as the president of Bowdoin College. I promise, when I give this talk other places, I do need to tell them these details, right? They don't know this. Chamberlain was adored among Civil War veterans and wrote extensively about the war and was regularly featured as a speaker at commemorations and encampments. But underneath his blue uniform and fine suits, the wound from Petersburg quietly tortured him. Because of the damage to his urethra, he had required a catheter after he was wounded. I want you to just think about what a mid-19th century catheter may have been like, right? This is another place where there are conflicting reports. And so I actually don't really include much about this in my book because it was difficult for me to establish sort of which was the correct report. Some reports say that it was a glass catheter at one point and that it broke. Again, there are other versions of that story. Friction, either way, friction, whether it was friction from the catheter or it was a catheter that broke, the catheter ended up creating a fistula, which is essentially an open hole near the base of his penis that never healed. And I'm sorry, this is also the part where I talk a lot about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's genitals, more than you expected someone would probably do. This fistula leaked urine. It left him susceptible to chronic bladder and testicular infections that caused him, in his own words, unspeakable agony. A surgery in 1883 attempted to close that fistula. Chamberlain barely survived the surgery, and his symptoms, including the fistula, soon returned. It just reopened, and they never attempted to close it again. He had it for the remainder of his life. Over the next 30 years, recurring infections plagued Chamberlain's self-described weak spot, often leaving him incapacitated. A pension examiner, and this is an image from this pension application, pension examiner noted in 1893 that painful adherent scars restricted his mobility. His testicles were permanently and painfully inflamed, and his penis was non-functioning. When he died in 1914, it was of an infection of that wound. So Chamberlain was a casualty of the war. It just took him 50 years to die. So despite his chronic pain, the recurring infections, the limited mobility, and other disabling symptoms, Chamberlain actually struggled to get pension funding from the federal government after the Civil War. There was an 1862 law that provided all men disabled in the line of duty a pension from the US government. Soldiers were paid according to the degree of their disability. They were required to have medical examinations, to go through a lengthy application process, provide paperwork from their enlistment and their discharge, often supplement all of that with their own words about their experience, but also with testimonials from friends and neighbors and doctors and really anyone that they could get. And in fact, Chamberlain is called on more than once to write those testimonials for his soldiers, right? Chamberlain was initially pensioned in the 1870s, but his payment was quite low. In 1892, after the failed surgery in 1883, and as aging was making his condition worse, he applied for an increase. And despite all of this apparent success in his life, he needed the money, right? This is when Fanny is getting more and more sick. As I seem to recall, Willis won't move out, right? And so he really does need this income. And he's trying all these different business ventures, right? And nothing is really totally panning out. So while it was very routine for men to request increases as the status of their disability changed over time, the Pension Bureau had exacting standards of proof. In particular, the Pension Bureau looked for disabled veterans who were essentially helpless. Because the pension system was linked to ideas about productivity, they had to demonstrate that they were completely unable to work and utterly dependent on others in order to get that federal support that they really needed. And this was a problem for Chamberlain, right? By 1892, Chamberlain had spent decades learning how to live independently, how to walk and sit and work so that it appeared that he was not disabled, which of course meant that he did not appear disabled, right? He did not appear disabled enough for the pension system. They look at him and they see a successful man, right? And that is not deserving of pension support. During the required medical exam for the requested increase, the doctor wrote in his observation that while he agreed that Chamberlain's pain and sickness were severe, the acute infections that he suffered were only episodic, which did not make him entirely dependent on others. It was only at those moments when he was at his sickest that he was dependent. The surgeon also noted that Chamberlain's muscular build was good, and though his hair was getting white, he showed no evidence of quote-unquote general debility. So he was denied that increase. Another pattern emerges in those pension applications that I want to talk about for 1 second. And that's the Bureau's anxiety over bodies that defied common beliefs about disability, specifically bodies with non-visible, nebulous, or confusing ailments. Can you go to the next one? A good way to illustrate this is to juxtapose Chamberlain with another soldier who had a similarly non-visible disability. And this guy, a proud son of my home state of New York, he's from Syracuse, New York, not far from where I grew up. His name is Henry Allenson Barnum. And Barnum served with the 127th New York. He was shot through the front left of his hip bone at the Battle of Malvern Hill in 1862. Very strange side note. He goes home, spoiler alert, he doesn't die, right? He goes home, he has a child, the child is a boy, he names him Malvern Hill Barnum, believe it or not. He becomes a military officer himself, Malvern Hill. Anyway, Barnum was taken prisoner after he was shot and endures an agonizing journey from the battlefield, wounded, to Libby prison, and then finally is exchanged and sent back to Syracuse to recuperate. Unsurprisingly, during all that time, infection set in to the wound. So to save his life, a physician cleaned the wound of bone fragments and instructed Barnum to wear a kind of soft fabric plug to keep the wound open and draining. Over the course of 2 years, during which time Barnum was given command of the 149th New York and promoted to brigadier general, he was fitted with what they called an oakum seton, which was a kind of rope that was threaded through the wound to encourage it to drain. That rope was then later replaced with long pieces of candle wick, which Barnum wore threaded through the open wound for the remainder of his life. And he has to rotate it, right? He has to continue rotating it throughout the day. I know, I'm sorry. It's just, this is, you should hear my students when I get going. Unlike Chamberlain, so he's living with a similar kind of wound, right? I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but he's living with a similar kind of wound that is also concealed under his clothing. Unlike Chamberlain, however, Barnum's wound became famous. Dr. George Otis, the curator of the Army Medical Museum, which was established during the war by the Surgeon General's office, requested that Major Barnum, at the time, Major Barnum's wound be photographed for inclusion in that medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion that I referred to earlier. So Barnum was photographed at the museum in Washington, D.C. in 1865. That photograph was then displayed in the museum. It was published in the Medical and Surgical History. Barnum included it in his original pension application in 1866. He also had private photographs made of the wound. The one in the middle is the original one that he has taken by the Surgeon General's office. You can sort of see the progression of how he's aging in the pictures, which I think is neat. So the middle one is the original. And this was a really common sort of pose in front of a mirror so they could see the front and the back of the wound. The one on the right is also taken at the behest of the Surgeon General's office. I believe the left is as well. This is when he's a veteran, many years after the war. He also, in Syracuse, has a private photographer take pictures of that wound as well. I don't know that they've ever been reproduced, but they're in the Historical Society, the Onondaga Historical Society. And so these photographs that he has taken of his wound make it publicly and visibly available in ways that Chamberlain's wound just could never be, right? By dint of where it was on his body. And perhaps as a result, I mean, I speculate this, that it seems likely, this is why Barnum's pension was raised by a special act of Congress to $100 a month, and Chamberlain couldn't get them to raise his at all. So during the time that Chamberlain is going back and forth with the Pension Bureau, as some of you might know, Chamberlain was writing his memories, his memoir of the war, memories that ended up culminating in the passing of the armies. His reflection on the surrender at Appomattox, published posthumously. And if you know anything about Chamberlain's writing, right, he is positively romantic. I mean, I think it's very clear in his writing that he believed, it comes through in everything that he writes about the war, really, that the war had been worth the collective sacrifice, right? That the war had a kind of transcendence to it. And yet, in his own letters, he does not figure his personal sacrifice into the calculus of whether the bloodletting of the war had been equal to the result. In his private correspondence, he refers to the wound as his old enemy, admitting often that he wished to defeat or overcome its effects. In one letter to his sister Say, Chamberlain describes standing almost transfixed at the Petersburg battlefield in the 1880s. He had traveled back down for some sort of reunion and stood there for a while wondering where exactly it was that he had laid, right? Where was the ground that held his blood? And contemplating to himself, what was this all for? And he never wrote that he gladly made a sacrifice for the Union. He never, he never reflects on that, right? He says to say that he stood there and thought about what it was all for and what it all meant. And he doesn't answer that question, right? He doesn't say it was worth it. I'm glad it happened. He hasn't made up his mind, right? He held a tension between truly believing in the necessity and the goodness of the metaphorical sacrifice of the Union, but feeling unsure and perhaps bitter about his own personal sacrifice. And what I believe made Chamberlain's story, you can skip to the next one. What I believe made Chamberlain's story so important to the history of Civil War disability is that no one ever talked about Chamberlain as a disabled person. So when I started out this project, I did exactly what Kid did, right? I went to everything that had been published on Chamberlain and I read it voraciously. And they are good works, right? They are incredible works. Especially spent a lot of time with Alice Raines Trulock's just immaculately researched biography of him, and just could not find anything about this wound. She mentions that it happens, right? She talks about the hip surgery and things like that, but just does not spend time with it. And I thought, man, if you've been wounded in that way, it must make up a bigger part of your life than this, right? So we really had just not thought about Chamberlain as a disabled person. He is a real hero of the Civil War era. You literally cannot walk around this town or someplace, in my experience, like Gettysburg, right, without seeing his face on keychains. I have one of them in my purse right now. And yet, biographies of him only made passing mention of his wound, of his decades of chronic pain, of his limited mobility, altered urination, and I think we can safely assume sexual dysfunction. To me, Chamberlain is the perfect example of something that disability scholar, disability historian named Douglas Bainton has written, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but that disability is everywhere in history if only you look for it, but often absent in the histories that we write. How was it that no historians had ever looked squarely at his disability? I believe, and I argue this in the book, that it's for the same reason that Chamberlain's pension increase was repeatedly denied. He didn't look disabled, right? He became very good at creating an image of able-bodiedness. He totally upends our expectations of what it means to be disabled. The Pension Bureau wanted to see a disabled person who was totally debilitated, who was utterly dependent on others. And I think we do too. We expect to see a cane or a crutch or a wheelchair. So when historians go looking for disabled Civil War veterans, they often glance right over people like Chamberlain because they just don't fit into our preconceived notions of what it means to be disabled. And I actually think that Chamberlain's story can push our history even a little bit further than that. In recent years, there's been this tension within Civil War scholarship between sort of light and dark scholarship. And historians like me, as you can probably imagine, are labeled dark historians because you go around talking about blood and gore and terrible things like that. And accusations are kind of thrown in either directions about whether it's bad to write about the glory and the honor of the war, and whether it's focusing on despair and horror and mangled bodies is in some way doing a discredit or damaging somehow our sense of this war. But I really believe that Chamberlain sort of gives the lie to this dichotomy. It's both, right? It's not one or the other. He embodied both worlds. He believed deeply that the war was good and worth it, and also believed that the war had exacted perhaps too high a price from him. He was successful, and yet he still struggled. And of course, it's not just Chamberlain. I'm going to leave you with one last example. Again, a guy from New York State. In the final chapter of my book, I trace the experiences of several young men who were institutionalized in the New York State Lunatic Asylum in Utica, New York. They were all institutionalized for mental illness that was somehow linked back to their war service. One of them was a young man who I'll call Daniel Folsom. That isn't his name, but New York State law requires that I don't tell you his name for privacy reasons because they're medical records. So Daniel Folsom, at one point verged on suicidal. Once he is in Utica, he actually begs the attendants to kill him and put him out of his misery. He had served in the war and come home and sort of been unable to keep up his work. His family couldn't care for him. He was wandering around and sort of incoherent and deeply depressed. They take him to Utica, where he's struggling with this suicidal ideation. He wants them to put him down out of his misery. Now, if I was to end the story there, right, that is really bleak. That's a young man who, from all the evidence we have, has been destroyed psychologically by the war, right? But Daniel's story doesn't end there. In 1864, he wrote to his sister from the asylum that he would, quote, try and be a man. And he did try. When he was released from Utica, he re-enlisted. Imagine that, right? He re-enlisted. He fought until the war ended, then he went home, he got married, and he had 6 daughters, which is actually 2 more daughters than I have. We are so primed to think of disability as intrinsically bad that we assume that someone like Daniel would have been just ruined by this experience, right? We believe so wholeheartedly that disability is a stable, unchanging reality that we assume that once you've been institutionalized, that's it, right? You are profoundly mentally ill forever. But Daniel shows us that that is not true. Just as Chamberlain shows us that sometimes disability looks a lot different than we assume. Instead of thinking in terms of dark and light, I propose that we think of them as 2 sides of the same coin. We can't have one without the other. Disability in all of its complicated and diverse forms is a necessary result of warfare, right? It just is. It goes hand in hand. So if we want the glory and the righteousness of our Civil War, we must also accept the physical and mental toll necessary to achieve them. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, as long as I'm not too complicated. No gotcha questions about Chamberlain, okay?
When you were showing the role and the amputee, particularly the amputee, you were saying that it was almost a glorification of the value of the war, and honoring the people who were amputated, and having them make a sense out of their loss as a great contribution to the Civil War. But how were the amputees to stop, whose cause was ended by the Civil War?
Yeah, did everyone hear that? So she asked, she was pointing to this image, and how I was talking about how people in the North kind of did this glorification, right? This way of presenting disabled bodies in a way of kind of upholding the cause of the Union. She asked, what was the situation for Southern amputees whose cause was lost, right? That's a great question. And one of the things that I don't write about this very much, because I didn't write about the South, but one thing that I know from scholars of Confederate veterans who were disabled is that instead of it being sort of how in the North it's glorified as part of the one cause, right? A sacrifice for this this thing that was really worth it and that was this incredibly important moment for American history. In the South, it becomes tied to sort of the reconstruction of the South, right? Reconstructing Confederate bodies becomes symbolic of reconstructing the South. And so they become really important in symbolically as well, right? If you support our Confederate veterans, and of course they are supported entirely through private charities and state governments, and like the state governments don't have a lot, right? Like there's not like overflowing coffers to pay for prosthetics. And so it was largely through private charities, one of which, get this people, was called ARMS, A-R-M-S. And I couldn't even, it was like aid to something named soldiers. I was like, that couldn't have been accidental, right? But these charitable organizations, that's how they raised money, was by saying, you know, by supporting our Confederate veterans. First of all, you're honoring the lost cause, but also it is a way of reconstructing the South. If we're gonna reconstruct ourselves, we have to have men, right? This also becomes a huge rallying cry for formerly Confederate women. This is something that they can do. Just like during the war, a lot of Confederate women, did a lot of the support work to sort of uphold, and then after the war, creating the lost cause, right? Through their memorializing of the war. They do the same thing when it comes to supporting disabled veterans, right? That is a way of sort of creating the myth and the fiction of the lost cause. Yeah, so it's different, but it's not all that different, right? It's different, and it also actually sort of points out just how much of what we think about disability is socially constructed, right? It means sort of different things in the different regions. Thank you.
So I'm from Brunswick, and I know where his gravesite is, and I was wondering why there isn't a bigger, why it's a very small plot, and wondering why there isn't a bigger plot for you.
This
It's right across from Bowdoin.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was just there today. This is a fantastic question that I cannot answer for you. But what's interesting is I was there today and I asked myself the same question. Somebody in this audience knows. Yeah, it's surprisingly, it is, compared to what you might see for someone in a different cemetery, you'd imagine that it would be some giant obelisk, right? Do you have an answer for us?
I believe that Joshua Chamberlain asked to have a very modest.
That doesn't surprise me.
That's what I'm.
Yeah. So the answer, for those of you who couldn't hear, was that they believe that Chamberlain asked. I know that his funeral, he asked for it to be modest, right? So he asked for that modest memorial. And this is something that I think is really interesting about Chamberlain, because his writing, I mean, one of the reasons that Chamberlain is sometimes, people, Civil War scholars kind of roll their eyes about Chamberlain, because in his writing after the war is like the opposite of modest, right? It's like, it's very flowery, it's very romantic, it's incredibly long-winded, right? We were talking today about the 5-hour-long speech that he gives at one point. And yet at the same time, when it kind of came to himself, he was a little bit more restrained, which I think is interesting.
So I was curious, you mentioned the survivors that had disabilities, only 7% were amputees. What was the top disability of the survivors?
Oh my God, that's such a math question. So I can't, well, okay, so I do have an answer for you. So the question, for those of you who didn't hear it, was, if only 7% of veterans who survived and were wounded were amputees, what were the next couple of big things, right? This is actually kind of complicated to answer because of the way that they collected these statistics, right? That statistic is specifically on men whose disabilities, or whose, I should say, wounds were documented medically during the war. So already we have people that weren't caught in that, right? It also is men who were wounded and not men who were sick. So in studying the pension records, which is where the vast majority of my research was in the pension records in the National Archives, most people were pensioned for the after effects of illnesses. And this actually became kind of complicated for me because it's a little, there is a little bit of a fight within disability studies and disability history over what kinds of illnesses count as disability, right? Because some illnesses are curable and therefore aren't considered necessarily disabling. Is that the same thing as being physically disabled, right? Ultimately, I decided to include sickness for a number of reasons. One is because the Union Army considered that a disability, and you could get a disability discharge for being sick, right? But one of the other reasons is because so many of the illnesses that men got during the war had chronic elements, right? So Chamberlain gets malaria during the war. There is no cure for malaria in the 19th century, right? You have malaria forever, and that's why they call it recurrent fever, because once you have it, 10 years later, you can have another kind of resurgence of those malaria symptoms and become very, very sick again. And so I saw a lot of guys with that. Also, the problem there is that it's much less obvious to the Pension Bureau that that's where it came from, right? You have to it's harder to have documentation that says, well, I got malaria from this one mosquito during the Overland campaign, right? Like, it's harder to say that. It's much easier to say, I was shot in the chest at Antietam, here's the medical documentation, right? So the biggest single thing is various kinds of illnesses. I'm sure that there is a statistic that is like the next one, like the biggest single one, right? But I don't really know what it would be. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Yeah.
You touched a little bit about this one gentleman who had the psychological issues, but really haven't gone too deep into that invisible disability.
Yeah.
Certainly there was a lot of post-traumatic stress. What was it called? How did society deal with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was about, at the end, I closed with that story of the young man who was institutionalized, but didn't talk very much about that kind of non-visible disability, a psychological disability. And what did that look like in that time period? How did people think about it? What was it called? So we today would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And often when I'm talking with students or if I'm giving talks, sometimes that's just what I say, because it makes sense to us. We know what it means, right? That terminology did not exist until post-Vietnam, right? And so at the time, there is a lot of disagreement among psychiatrists. Of course, they don't call themselves psychiatrists at that time, but among doctors, right, and superintendents of institutions about even what causes mental illness, let alone whether it could be considered quote unquote traumatizing. That idea doesn't really exist yet. And there are debates about whether your environment can cause a mental illness or whether it's always hereditary, right? Whether it's always something ingrained in you or ingrained in the makeup of your brain. And even that shifts over time, right? A Civil War veteran himself, a guy named Silas Weir Mitchell, becomes one of the pioneering neurologists of the late 19th century. He's the guy that first identifies phantom limb syndrome. He becomes really interested in neurology and believes that I'm the wrong kind of doctor, right? That it can always be traced back to the physical makeup of your brain, right? And so the idea of trauma is not sort of medically linked yet. John Jacob DaCosta identifies soldiers coming into his practice who are having what he calls, he comes up with a diagnosis called soldier's heart. And sometimes it's referred to as irritable heart. And it's essentially heart palpitations. These men are having panic disorders or they're having symptoms of panic, right? anxiety disorders. In my research, I researched 3 different institutions, have never seen a diagnosis of soldier's heart. And this is just because different doctors had different sort of things that they focused on and different ways that they chalked that up, right? If someone went to DaCosta and explained that to him, he would diagnose it with soldier's heart. But the doctor at Utica would say, no, like for instance, I have a sailor who was hit in the head with a piece of a spent shell in a naval bombardment. And he's institutionalized at Utica. He's very unwell, he's very depressed. Today, we would probably say he had a traumatic brain injury, right? The doctors there said he's a chronic masturbator, and that's why he's mentally ill, right? They just had a completely different framework. I told you, I'm very popular. And that was considered a cause of mental illness. In the mid-19th century, it was. You don't want to know what the treatment plan was for that. So, very briefly, all that to say, this is controversial in the field of Civil War era studies because you can't point to a document and say this guy was diagnosed with PTSD because he wouldn't have been, right? And so instead you have to kind of pull all these pieces together and say, I surmise that whatever, right? I don't argue in my book that Chamberlain was traumatized, but I think we can all probably agree that he carried a level of trauma with him. And a different kind of reading of his letters, of his papers, I think shows that. But the sort of sourcing requirements of history make it really hard to make that argument. So I believe very strongly it existed. I have soldiers that I believe absolutely had it. I write about it a little bit, but it's very, very difficult to get at. So that was a long roundabout answer. Yes?
So there were a lot of free black soldiers who fought. Were they entitled to the same disability pensions as white soldiers?
Okay, so the question was about black soldiers, so United States colored troop soldiers who may have been injured in the line of duty. Were they also eligible for the same kind of support, like pensions? The answer is yes. They were eligible for pensions. It was much harder for them to get pensions. Yeah, surprise, right? Obviously because racism, right? But also because of racist medical beliefs about black bodies. So sort of the prevailing medical wisdom at the time was that black men possessed a sort of brute strength, but also a less strong kind of constitution of their health. And so while they could perform all that great manual labor, digging ditches and stuff that the Union Army has them doing, once their health was damaged, they were useless. And they were just mustered out. So that's why we have an invalid corps that's created for wounded or sick white soldiers, and there's never a similar organization made for black soldiers. So they could absolutely apply for pensions. They had a harder time proving to the Pension Bureau that their ailments were worthy of being pensioned, and then they typically were pensioned at much lower rates. Yeah, it's not a shocking answer, but it's still a disheartening one, right? Yes?
A similar question. I'm thinking about the Southern disabled soldiers, and were they able to apply for pension? No. Yes, exactly. Confederate veterans were not eligible for obvious reasons for federal pensions. So that meant that they had to rely on those charitable organizations or on their state governments. And the state governments do pension them. Sometimes some states are able to do more than others. And where they can't give them cash payouts, they do give them the option for, at the very least, prosthetics, which is something the U.S. federal government also does, is provide prosthetics for soldiers. They often just didn't provide very good ones. And so a lot of times soldiers went and commissioned their own private ones when they could pay for them because they were better quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you.